This is another insanely cool tool for watchmaking, like a factory tool. And I also bought this from Feather House. I just from the pictures of this, I was pretty much obsessed with it because I was like, what the hell does that do? And that's the bottom of it. So this was, I paid 59 francs for this back in February. And I couldn't figure out what it was, so I was like, well, I have to check that out. So here it is. And either I broke or it broke in shipping or it was already broken. There's a pivot point here. Let's see if I can show you that. This lever draws back these two arms, which are spring driven, this one and this one. And this has a shaft underneath it that the tip had broken off of, so you couldn't screw it down. So I remade that on the lathe. And then another thing is, both of these have set screws in the side. There's a threaded screw inside here, and then there's a steel set screw. And so there's like a brass insert that's trapped between the tip of the steel and the threaded shaft there. So when I replaced it, I also replaced I took a little piece of brass and replaced just cut a tiny bit off of that and put it in there as well. But that attention to detail is crazy. I've seen that in other Swiss watch tools. Instead of having steel on steel, you have a brass insert. Okay, so I guess I'll just tell you what this is for. It's basically for setting pallet stones in tiny, tiny pallet forks. And it would be a kind of one-off tool. Now, there may be thousands and thousands of pallet forks this small, but this is a tiny, tiny pallet fork. But basically, the pallet fork sits at the center of this tool. I'm just going to do some big movements, so I'm not going to put it there yet so I don't damage it. You put the pallet fork here, and then you swivel this piece in to center, and it centers perfectly on this pin, so it goes down perfectly. And I'll show you with the microscope that underneath here first of all there's a jewel for the pallet pivot in here. This goes down and presses on that jewel, presses the pallet fork down, and then you press this down with your fingers to have the pallet fork sit perfectly flat down there. And then you swivel this. Now open this so you can see what happens. With that pressed down, and that's with the pallet fork without the pallet stones in it yet. You press this down, and then you pull this in. This is spring driven, and not simple springs. These two springs are pushing each of these sides in. So you want this to close very gently on the back of the pallet fork, and make sure it's aligned. There's also a locating pin for the actual fork side of the pallet fork that I'll show you also under the microscope. But basically, you swivel this until it traps it, and you do that with this part in place and with your finger on it, holding everything gently down so it's flat. Bring this in, and then at this point, it starts to. Right now, it'll stop because the springs will let it stop wherever the back of the pallet fork is. But it brings it in, holds it tight, and then when you bring it over a little bit this way, there's some kind of cam in here that actually pushes the whole this winged piece down and clamps both of these down flat to the base. So there's no tension on the pallet fork at that point, forward or backward, but there's a solid backing on each side. And the reason for that is that you then place your pallet stones. And then you use this lever, and this comes in and pushes the pallet stones exactly where they need to go, to the exact, distance. And under the microscope, you'll see how precise that is. I think the other thing is once you do this, and this would all probably be done under a loupe or a microscope, of course, the pallet stones are pushed just the right depth into the pallet fork, which would be like a pressure fit. And then this whole block would probably be heated so that you could put shellac. You apply shellac on the tops of the pallet stones, and then gently, and this is also insane, I'll also have to show you this under the microscope, you would then pull all these positioners away, and then push this, and this lifts 3 pins that the pallet fork is sitting on to lift it like 1 or 2 millimeters, so you can grab it with the tweezers gently and put it, into the assembly process. Now, I'm going to do the same thing with the microscope, but I wanted to show that so that it's not a complete mystery what you're looking at with the microscope. Because once you get into, you have to understand how that detailed view applies to everything else. But the other thing is, all this stuff is adjustable for the depth of the pallet stones, which of course it would have to be. So this pusher it's got this spring back here that pulls these 2 arms together. And when they're pulled together, they push on these 2 blades, right? But these 2 blades can go only to a certain position, which is determined by these positioning bolts, let's say, which also are, there's a spring against them that's weaker than this spring's pulling power. But this is how you would tune how deep you set the pallet stone. And then so that doesn't slip, so it doesn't introduce an error, you've got a set screw under here, which I guarantee you also has a brass fitting so that set screw doesn't damage the threads on the positioning screws. I mean, it's crazy. And then you also have set screws to put these springs in and to adjust the tension of those springs. Completely nuts. The amount of effort that would have gone into making a tool like this just blows my mind. And then over here, let's look again at I forget what the situation is, but basically you've got a cam right here that is let me get this under the top camera correctly. There's a cam on the bottom of this shaft that's going against this spring, or there's like a plunger under here that's pushing this. Okay, so yeah, so that's it. This is not a spring. This is just a bow that is pressing these guys, which are each of these clamps, which are spring loaded to go in. This cam on the bottom of this pushes that plunger, which pushes this bow. The bow is pushed against its own spring, which is centered on this screw, to bring it back. And it pushes against these 2 springs, which are pushing each of those clamps inward. So again, here you have like spring driven in both directions, but you have, depending on the position of that cam, the spring can go, one spring wins out over the other. So you pull the whole thing back, open it up for the pallet stone positioning clamps. We will put I'll do it under the microscope in a second. Swing this in, and it drops perfectly centered over the pallet fork. This thing has 3 points on it that are all spring-loaded to hold the 3 sides of the pallet fork, the center of the fork and each of the arms, to push those down, even while the jewel set, the pivot on top and its staff are already held by a centerpiece on this. 3 more pieces come down, spring held by, pushed up by a spring, so you can manually push down. while you clamp these clamps for the back of the fork down with this clamp. Totally crazy and so cool. And just to think of somebody making that, and then how necessary it is because of the size of pallet forks. Now another thing, this whole thing is like, it's a reminder of how hard they worked to make these watches back in the day, before you had CNC and robotics to do a lot of this miniature stuff in a world where it's just being done by micro tooling on big robots. The reason I say big robots is like the Swiss Nano and these CNC machines that do tiny things are actually quite big, the machines themselves. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing under the microscope. I'm going to pull these clamps back. The cam is now holding them back. I'm going to try to place the pallet fork in the jewel. Now, this is hard to do because of the scale, but it's also hard to do under the microscope. Okay, so now there's a positioning pin. I can zoom in on the microscope a bit here. There's a positioning pin underneath the fork side of the pallet fork. And okay, so now I'm setting this with its pivot in the jewel. Now see, if you immediately adjusted this and pushed it in, it'll pop the fork out of the jewel. It might even, worst case scenario, bend the pivot on the fork, the bottom center pivot. So you don't do that. You bring this in, come down over the fork. Now this is also being pulled down by a spring, so that center portion, which fits over the top of the staff is secured. And then you push this down with your finger, and this brings down 3 more points. If the jewel wasn't there, those points would touch the little clamps for the pallet jewels in the end of the pallet fork. If the jewel is there, it's going to also push the jewel down flat, which is probably also part of the process. But in any case, what I deduced is that you would want to hold that in place even without the pallet jewels there yet, and you would want to bring these back clamps in. So they're spring driven, so they just come up and they just land there. Then you keep going, and they're actually, this lever actually clamps these 2 clamps down so they can't move. Then you can lift this, and your pallet fork is perfectly backed, and not by spring but by a clamp that's clamped down. It's perfectly backed, so after you place your jewels, that was a terrible demo, so I just whacked it. It should go back in there, and you can see actually there's no spring tension on these. They're clamped down. I am kind of wondering when you would insert the pallet stones. But let's say you could just insert them but not push them in all the way. Because see, before they're shellacked, they can slide this way and this way. In any case, I think you would want to close this again, hold it down, and then with the stones in place, but before shellacking, you pull this lever forward, and then lift this up, And this tells you, okay, the stones are flat because you've put the stones in there now, and this has pushed the stones to the exact depth that they need to go. And again, that's because these settings have been set for this particular pallet fork and tuned perfectly. If it wasn't correct, somebody down the assembly line would say, hey, these pallet forks are no good. They're off by whatever, which you would figure out with a Peterman escapement meter. But anyway, that's another video. So then you hold this down. This pushes your pallet stones into the correct depth. And then you lift this. You can visually see everything is in the correct position. So then you would apply shellac to the stones and then wait a little bit for it to harden, which means maybe this whole thing wouldn't be hot. But that also may be why you have this. It may have actually been hot, and then you have this way of very delicately removing it, which is by this plunger. So then your stones are at the right depth. So you pull this lever back, and then you getting ready to remove the pallet fork from the tool, so you pull this lever back. The cam draws that bow back, which draws those clamps back. Then you push this button and it lifts it in the air so you can grab it with your tweezers and then put it in the batch of ones you're working on, whatever, and do the next one. So that is just the most extraordinary tool I've ever seen. And I think when, like, this whole thing of exploring watchmaking, I'm of course super interested in how watch movements work, but it's equally as fun to explore the ingenuity that had to go into these tools to simplify the assembly process. And I mean, it's still going on today with CNC. I don't doubt that the modern CNC manufacturing is, even more complicated than this, way more complicated in a way. But this boils it down to these beautiful objects that were just designed by someone and manufactured as one-off, tools. This is very heavy too, solid block of steel. Anyway, I just think that's so cool. I hope you understand how this thing works now as well as I do. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And thanks for watching.